So, a lot of you may know me, some of you don't. I'm Alex Oftelie. I'm the SVP for Decision Science here at BWF. So decision science is actually two components. It's analytics, or what we call data science, and engagement science, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So very excited to go through this topic. Again, a lot of content, a lot of concepts to share, but I'm going to do my best to keep us kind of moving at a good pace to at least introduce you to what's going on and hopefully inspire you to think about your organization, your organization's constituency, and their engagement in a new way. So our agenda, very briefly, I really want to challenge everyone to reframe their perspective of how you consider engagement and how you think about engagement. So I'm going to provide what might be a new idea or a new perspective for you that I think is very, very helpful. From that, we're going to get into the discussion around engagement alignment. So how well is your organization aligned with the engagement of your constituents? We'll talk a little bit about kind of how that bears out, what that looks like. And then from there, we're going to talk a little bit about, now that we understand engagement from a different perspective, now that we understand the concept of engagement alignment, what are ways that we can measure this? And then what are some ways that we can analyze it? And then finally, leave you with some next steps. So hopefully after the call today, you can get started, look through some of the data you may already have, or get moving on projects to help us navigate these challenging times. So reframing our perspective. One of the things that, if you've had a chance to work with me, especially maybe over the last 18 months, is I'm very much a person who's very particular about language. And so a lot of times in analytics, we'll build a connection score, and it's a measure of connectivity. So how close or how far are you away from an organization based upon giving, activity, demographic factors, et cetera. So to me, that's different than engagement. So I use the word connection. But most often when I'm describing connection, people think that's engagement, and that's the same thing. So let me explain. The common approach to measuring engagement or understanding engagement is we measure what people do. Essentially, we measure kind of what's tracked in our database. So what might be in Salesforce, or what might be in Tessitur or Razor's Edge? Did you give? Have you come to an event? Have you done these certain things? And so these are activities or actions. Sometimes they're demographic or biodemographic factors, like, are you an alum, or have you been a patient or a ticket holder? But basically, we measure the actions of what people have done as engagement. And so, for example, I give $1,000 a year to the University of Minnesota. So they might say, Alex cares about us, or he's engaged $1,000 worth. So I want to challenge you that is a engagement. And that's just actually a measure of activity or outcome. Because that's just solely focused on observed, what we call engagement, but it's just really focused on what. And it's not at all focused on why. And so that's the new concept that I want to challenge everyone to think about, is what we track in our database is just merely an outcome. It's an expression of engagement, or it can be an expression of engagement. But if you're a nonprofit, really at the end of the day, unless you're putting a name on a new library or nanotech science building, engagement is kind of measured. The engagement of our constituents is the currency that's our product. That's what we engage with them on, and that's why they support us, right? So I give to the University of Minnesota not because it's rational, not because it's an economic engine for the state of Minnesota. I give because I'm a diehard Golden Gopher, and I'm a big supporter, and the institution means a lot to me. So my engagement is why I give. And so instead of measuring the activity, what can we do to measure the feeling that precedes the activity or drives the behavior? And so this is the different perspective around thinking about engagement. So not just looking at what people do, but truly trying to understand the why, which is how they feel. So there is an emerging science that's becoming very, very popular called behavioral economics, which is kind of a blend of psychology and economic theory, which discusses and actually captures a lot of philanthropic motivation. And so the reasons why people are engaged with an organization are based on a variety of factors: cognitive, social, cultural, emotional. There's all sorts of reasons why people might connect with your organization. And so how do we understand these just from activity? And furthermore, if someone's not really supporting you at a high level, or they're not supporting you at all, does that mean that they don't care about you or they're not engaged? So the traditional measures of just looking at philanthropic outcomes might suggest they are. I would suggest that they're not. And so let me share a little bit deeper around that. And so why is that? So essentially, human psychology has come to this conclusion that we have kind of two sides to our brain. Often we call it the elephant and the rider, okay? So the elephant represents our emotional self. It's very powerful, it's kind of hard to control. And then we have the rational side of our brain, which is kind of the one that's hopefully going to drive our behavior. And so what we currently capture right now is relatively kind of the rational self. So I came to an event, I RSVP'd and showed up, I made a gift, I referred someone, I volunteered, came to a performance. But we don't give because of those things. We give because our emotional response to an organization, our emotional connectivity. Now we have both this rational self and emotional self in us at all times. And it's just kind of one of the joys of being a human being, right? Is we have both these sides to us, right? So think about, especially in this time of shelter at home orders, you know, a lot of us are out there, I'm gonna do the push-up challenge and I'm gonna get up early. Maybe I'm going to my home gym or I'm working out, I'm gonna study piano, I'm gonna eat really well. That's how I'm gonna spend these next 30 days now that I'm sheltered at home in Minneapolis to really improve my life. And then what ends up happening? We sleep in, we don't do the 10 push-ups, I eat mega stuffed Oreos, right? And so that's not good or bad, but we have these plans and ideas in our mind, in our rational side, but really what often drives our behavior is the emotional self. And again, going back to philanthropy, our product or what we're able to sell is someone's emotion and engagement for our organization. So our ability to be able to capture it and understand it really gives us a new level of power. So what can we do to understand the elephant, or can it be understood? And the answer in a broad sense is yes, right? So the elephant is emotional. They know what they want, but they're open to direction, right? They can be driven in certain ways. So they're open to suggestions. So think about like the power of increasing the ask amounts on an annual fund appeal, right? You might get the same amount of donors, but you might get more money because we're open to direction. And they often don't think very long-term on the emotional side, but this is why we give. So for example, and this is also why we acquire donors, right? We often talk about the emotional and rational self being, you give for the first time because you're emotionally moved by something. That's why the ASPCA doesn't talk about that they helped 2 million animals last year and that 80 cents of every dollar goes to saving animals. They show you a picture of a sick little kitty and you're emotionally moved to that. And that's why people are acquired as donors, and that's why we give for the first time. A year later, we may do kind of like a Yelp review and say, hey, I gave to ASPCA last year. Was that a good idea? Yeah, it was good. And then we rationally, and that's when we renew. And that's kind of how the emotional side and rational side, we see that in giving, see it all the time in major giving too. How many times do we get the yes on the proposal? And then all the rational stuff, we got to figure that out. And that takes longer. So it's the 2 yeses on there. So we see this all the time in philanthropy, but typically what we pay attention to when we try to measure engagement is this rational activity and not so much how people feel. So to do this, the best way to do this is through active listening. And so that is essentially directly asking our constituents how they feel about us. You know, there's 2 kinds of listening. There's passive listening and active listening. Passive might be some forms of, for example, reading social or social media metadata, what people are saying about an organization. It's hard to connect that information with who's saying it. And they might be talking about topics and themes that we're not very interested in. So still the best way to actually understand how your constituents feel about you is to directly ask them. And that way we can ask what we want to know, and we can also identify who's talking. And that's critical to this section. So, and why is that so critical? So not only do I want to ask our constituents, how you feel about us, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between satisfaction and engagement in a moment, but I want to be able to tie that back with what they actually do. And so this is what I'm talking about with that idea around the alignment of the engagement of our constituency. Because every organization I work with has some degree of what I call engagement inefficiency. And it's just natural. It doesn't mean an organization's good or bad. It's just natural to working with human beings because we have rational sides and we have emotional sides. And so every organization has some amount of folks. From my observations, it's between 20 and 40%. 20 and 40% of your constituency, I would contend, fits into one of these two categories. They express that they love you, but we have not observed that. They haven't made a gift, they haven't volunteered, they haven't come to an event, etc. So that's some portion. They love you, but they're not acting like it. So they might look like they're not engaged, but they actually feel very engaged. And then you have another portion of folks who are doing things that we're like, oh, this is great. Alex is giving $1,000 a year. But you might ask me, and I might be like, I'm like a 1 or a 2 in terms of my engagement. So people actually do things, even though they're not necessarily as engaged. They do it out of a sense of loyalty. They do it out of kind of a sense of inertia. There's lots of reasons. They do it out of a sense of they're hoping things will change and they're going to stick with it. But not everybody who's in your database that loves you acts like it. And not everyone who acts like they love you feels the same way that you feel about them. And so it's our ability to be able to understand these two groups. This one from this high to low right here, hopefully you can see my mouse. If you have high expressed engagement, but low connectivity, that's a activation issue. So you love us. I just haven't figured out how to capture that love in terms of philanthropic or financial activity. And on the other side, people that are doing lots of things, but have low expressed engagement, we haven't stewarded you well enough, or we're having an issue showing you the impact of your support for us, how much that means, and how important that is. So by being able to ask questions and then align that data with the folks in our constituency, we can really identify what is our engagement inefficiency. And so this is some sample data. I changed some of the counts around a little bit, but you'll get kind of the picture. So the top row there is a connection score. So that's that measurement. Remember, I used the word connection. It's a measure of philanthropic activity. Are you coming to events? Are you an alum? Are you related to people? Can we get a hold of you, et cetera? So just kind of measuring all the stuff from the database. How warm or cool are you to the organization? And then we asked folks how they felt about us. And the folks in red, they observed, they look like they're very connected. When we ask them how they feel, they don't feel very engaged at all, even though their behavior suggests otherwise. Well, imagine what their behavior would look like if they did feel engaged. Because they're already acting somewhat like it. Imagine how that would grow. And then the folks in blue, these are folks that, oh, I love this organization. I couldn't imagine a world without. This place is so important to me, but they're not doing anything. So they have that core product. They have that core idea, that feeling for us. We have not yet been able to really activate it in a significant way. And so if you're thinking about organizations moving forward or through this uncertain time, obviously our warmest and very engaged, we're already focused on those. You don't need my help identifying the people that love you and do a lot of stuff. But these pockets of opportunity where we are not quite hitting the message with folks that are actually doing things that we appreciate, or we're not yet activating folks who really love us, these are some of the most immediate areas that I think organizations are best to be focused on as they move through these uncertain times and into the new normal. And just for a count perspective, these two groups right here actually represent 22% of this constituency. So that's their engagement inefficiency is about 22%. So we talked about engagement is not what people do, but how they feel. We've talked about the power of being able to align what people feel with what they do and figure out where it matches and where it's misaligned. And where it's misaligned is a great opportunity for us to focus. So now we need to think about how do we actually capture this? And again, surveys are still the best approach, because that way I can directly ask you a question and you can give me an answer of how I feel. One of the things, though, that I see most common when I talk to clients about survey work and they share some of their previous survey work is there's often a misunderstanding or a misdefinition around satisfaction and engagement. So much like connection and engagement, I was explaining earlier, hopefully I did a clear enough job for everyone, that those are kind of tangential but distinct concepts. Satisfaction and engagement are also kind of like distant cousins, but they're not the same thing, okay? So satisfaction is most often or typically a one-off measurement of a specific event, a moment in time, a specific leader, idea, priority, event you came to, etc. It has actually very limited explanation of your future activity. Engagement, on the other side, is a little bit more ephemeral. It's a little bit more ambiguous, somewhat in definition, but this is truly why people support or do not support or continue to be loyal, or we might lose them in uncertain times, organizations philanthropically. And engagement really is kind of, like I said, it's a more foundational feeling, it's a more foundational concept. It doesn't change that often, and this is why people really support you. So if you want to think about this in a concept that maybe makes more sense, think about all the restaurants. So especially if you live in an area that's in a shelter at home where restaurants are closed. So in Minneapolis, all restaurants and bars are closed to, except takeout, they're all closed to May 1st. So think about if that was in your area, think about all the restaurants and bars you might go to, and then think about the one that you want to go to the second you can have an opportunity to get out of your house. That's probably the one that you're most engaged with. Even though you've gone to lots of different restaurants, that's the single note, that's the important place. I can't wait to get back to Barbette and have the steamed mussels, which is one of my choices. And even though I go to Barbette, I could go to Barbette and I could have a bad meal. So my satisfaction would be very, very low. It wasn't cooked right. The server was rude to me. It was really loud, whatever. I still love Barbette. I'm still going to go back. So my SAT might be low, but my SAT's not explaining my love for this place, right? But if you have low engagement and low satisfaction, then you really have very little opportunity to continue to keep folks supportive of you. So satisfaction is not what we're looking to measure. We're not looking to measure point in time. We're looking to measure larger ephemeral feelings from our constituency. And so there's a couple items that I will include here, kind of giving away a little bit of my approach and methodology, which I'm happy to discuss more. But just, let's just say I was asking you about BWF. So I would say, overall, how engaged are you with BWF? And this is the core to our engagement index. So what we can take this, usually I'll build this as a Likert scale, 1 to 5. And so we can take the mean, overall, the attendees of this webinar gave us a 3.2. That's our engagement index. We can track over time. Or I can figure out how many people gave us a 5. But notice what's different in here versus like developing a connection score. I'm asking you to define your level of engagement. I don't explain it to you. I don't give you a definition and say, do you fit this, that you're engaged or not. There, I'm allowing respondents to express to me how they feel in their own terms, which is one of the ways that we can really uncover that emotional side. Underneath engagement, there's lots of elements. I like to break it down into pride, passion, and awareness of an organization are the other themes that I like to ask a lot of items around or questions around. And pride of affiliation is definitely a significant predictor of support with an organization. So I might be really affiliated with a local charity, but I didn't really like the way that an arts organization, I didn't really appreciate or care for the way they handled the current furlough. So I'm not really like, oh, I don't want to tell people I'm associated with XYZ Symphony. I'm engaged with them, but I'm not really proud of what's going on there right now. So pride is a subcomponent of engagement. It leads into it. It doesn't measure everything, but this is an example of a different question that we can ask. And then here's one, and this is what I think is going to be the most important survey question that you could ask. If you had a one-question survey, and you could ask all your constituents, I would start with this. And I would say, could you imagine a world without your organization? Could you imagine a world without BWF? And the reality is, in this uncertain time, we are going to retain the same level of support from some of our constituents. Some might have the ability and feel inspired to increase their level of support, knowing that it's uncertain times. But we're also going to, we're all going to have some changes in our constituents and the level of support that we're getting. So it's not going to be business as usual. It's not going to be year over year. And for these folks that might fall away or their support might dial down a little bit, their feeling about us being an essential part of to them or their identity is the single most important predictor of will they come back and how soon might they come back. So for me, as I mentioned before, I'm a proud alum of the University of Minnesota, youngest recipient of a Lifetime Alumni Association Service Award, was on the alumni board. This place is essential to me. Now, if I stopped giving, I couldn't imagine a world without the U, which is what we call the U of M here in Minnesota. So if I did stop giving, I couldn't imagine a world without BWF. The second, or U of M, the second I had the opportunity to, I would start supporting again, because this place is essential to my identity. So how people answer these questions, we're not talking about COVID. We're not talking about a case for support. We're not talking about how do you feel about our events or a specific thing. We're just saying, hey, how do you feel about us? Are you happy to be, do you like being associated with us? Could you imagine if we were not here? And how people respond to these ephemeral questions are going to be the strongest predictors in this uncertain time of the engagement that's going to drive philanthropic activity in the future. So now that I've explained a different perspective of measuring engagement by understanding how people feel, how we can align it with their actions to understand the difference between how people feel and how they act. And we've talked a little bit about methods to capture. I should say a couple other notes on method capture. I try to keep all of my surveys, if I'm having a conversation with a constituent, to no more than 12, but hopefully under 10 items that you can take in under 2 minutes. It's not meant to be a long, laborious process. I also recommend that clients, that this survey is neither anonymous or confidential. We can store the results, we can share them and track them over time. So I know how Alex felt 6 months ago, and I know how Alex felt today, and we did some other stuff to try to engage him, and I know how Alex feels in the future. I really don't think anonymous anonymity or confidentiality is a significant issue here. We live in a survey culture, right? You order a pizza, you rent a car, you take a flight, you go to the grocery store, you get a survey. We're used to taking surveys all the time. It's private information, we're not going to share it. But I don't think we need to get into that. But that allows us to be able to merge this information in understanding who they are and understanding what they do, which I'm about to show you in a second. The third piece, which is different from satisfaction, which I talked about a couple of slides ago, and I apologize, I forgot to mention it then, is that engagement, this is meant to be designed as a process that we can reproduce time over time. It's kind of like going to the doctor, right? So every time you go to the doctor, no matter what you're there for, they always take your blood pressure, your temperature, and your pulse. It could be there because your eyes hurt, your knee's funny, you got something on your skin, you have a pre-op for something. Every time you're there, they do those three things. Our perspective around understanding engagement, I feel, should be the same. Every time, maybe every 6 months, every 8 months, once a year, we're reaching out to the people who are in our universe. We say, hey, what's your blood pressure, pulse, and temp? How do you feel about us? And so keep that survey the same and repeat it over time to be able to say, hey, we were kind of low in pride before, so we spent the next 9 months working on communication and messaging, used some digital strategies, some direct mail appeals. We just talked about all the great things we're doing. We went back and asked folks again, that pride went up. And if that pride goes up, I know engagement's gonna go up, and then activity and giving is gonna go up. So finally, again, if you have questions, I wanna remind folks that there's a question box at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to submit something to the Q&A, and we'll have a few minutes here at the end to be able to get into some of those items. So again, we've talked about engagement as how people feel, not what they do. To me, that's connection. Engagement's how you feel. We talked about how that's different from satisfaction. We talked about aligning it to understand kind of our engagement and efficiency, and we talked about ways to capture it. Okay, now that I have all this analysis, what do I do? Or now that I have all this data, what do I do? And there's lots of ways that we can use this to make this impactful for our organizations. Now that I not only know how your constituents act towards you, I know how they feel about you. So for example, and this is something that we see not surprising to us anymore, but surprising to a lot of our clients, is just stark examples of this, what I call engagement inefficiency. So this is a sample, and this, the blue bars are, we asked, how do you feel about us? How engaged are you with this organization? And the red line actually represents the engagement of folks who we describe as loyal donors. So these were people who had given every fiscal year at least one gift for the last 5 fiscal years. So they're giving annually, and they've given for the last 5 years. And so not surprisingly, more of the loyal donors describe themselves as very engaged, nearly 55%, compared to everybody overall. But what stood out to us was the large percentage of folks who were loyal donors who considered themselves not at all engaged. Now, it was not my job, and I'm not the expert into unpacking all the details why and how to remedy that. Spoiler alert, the client was able to address this, but it was really powerful for them to see that there was a significant portion of folks who they think are, oh, yeah, Alex gives every year. He must be very engaged. He must love us. We asked Alex how he felt. He gave himself a 1. So and imagine what these folks will do. Imagine what their contribution amount will be. Imagine their willingness to share and be a volunteer fundraiser, to come to events, to purchase more tickets, to invest in new ideas. Imagine they're already acting in a way that we define as engaged, just connected. Imagine what that will look like if they actually feel engaged. So this was a huge finding for this in this specific organization, to understand that all these folks that they just kind of put on the shelf of saying, oh yeah, these people give every year, we don't need to worry about them. Well, actually 20% of those folks said they're not really very connected. There was some political things and cultural things that it was capturing at that moment in time, but this was important for them to be able to understand that. Just for definition, LAG means leadership annual giving donor. And so not surprisingly, the relationship between someone's expression of engagement and then what their activity was, right? So that's that alignment piece where we're crossing those up. And so folks that said that they were very engaged with an organization, they were 9 times more likely to be a leadership annual giving donor than the average constituent, and they were 14 times more likely to be a major donor. So there's definitely a relationship there, and a relationship that we can measure. And so then, if I know, Alex and Andy are both very engaged, Alex is a major donor, Andy is not, maybe Andy is someone I should go talk to because he's 14 times more likely than any other random constituent to be a major donor. Or if I know that Alex is a major donor and he's feeling very engaged, and Andy is not, and he's not feeling very engaged, maybe I should focus on engagement around him right now, try to warm him, share with him messages about how essential this organization is and how much the support matters in terms of what they can able to do and impact on the community to raise his engagement. So then therefore, I might be able to come back at a later time and he might become a major gift prospect for me. So we can do work prior to assigning names, prior to putting people into portfolios to raise their overall level of engagement, which puts them more in line for us for that kind of significant level of philanthropic investment. And finally, this is another example of how we can measure engagement and how that looks in terms of philanthropic activity. So now, not surprisingly, the items in gray here on your left, that's how people felt. We asked them how they felt. They told us, how engaged are you? 5's top, 1's the bottom. And then we looked at their average giving. Now, this was skewed towards a more high net worth population, so the giving numbers seem larger, but the principles and the patterns we see align. So not surprisingly, the more you express to us unrelated to giving, just you said you're engaged, the more your average lifetime gift is, the more you've given recently, and the more gifts you've actually made. But beyond that, our ability to be able to connect that feeling of engagement, which is often kind of nebulous to us and ephemeral, and to philanthropic outcomes, provides even another opportunity to begin to assess the value and impact of alumni relations, grateful patient programs, marketing and communications, and stewardship. All these things that we all know are essential to high-functioning philanthropic activity, but can often be difficult to measure in a dollar term their impact as compared to, for example, a development officer. And so what I was able to do, what we focused in on was, let's just take all these people who rated themselves a 4. And it was 145 folks. They said, I'm a 4 out of 5. I'm pretty engaged. And if I said, okay, if we could just focus on that group of 4s, the people that self-identified as a 4, and I did a intensive 12-month engagement strategy. And, I flew them around to special events, and, they got access to different things, and we spent lots of time on them, and we had dedicated people to go visit them all the time. And it wasn't even about solicitation. It was just about engagement. It was just about raising how they feel about us. If I could do that, we can project the lift of, if I was able to lift those 4s to 5s and how they tell us they feel, that's worth $9 million is what we're projecting. And that's the growth from $61,000 to $128,000 average donor lifetime value. So that's about $9 million. And so again, going back to this idea around grateful patient, stewardship, alumni relations, marketing and communications, all these essential functions within our organizations, we could say, wow, well, it's going to cost those groups, it's going to cost them $400,000 for this 12-month engagement spree. Is that going to be worth it? Well, if we project it's going to be worth $9 million over the lifetime of the organization, maybe that's an investment worth making. I don't know. That's a question you can have, but what we can actually start to measure is the direct relationship between moving up somewhat how someone feels in a way, connecting that with their direct philanthropic outcome. So those are just a few of the ideas and the ways that we can use this data once we can tie how people feel and what their actual activity is. You can really see some of the power of being able to understand this and hopefully drive and motivate the elephant a little bit more. So some next steps, I think we're still pretty on time here. We covered a lot of ground. So where do you go from here? Obviously everyone has a lot on their plate right now. You're considering lots of strategies. Every day brings, new blessings and new challenges. But the places I would start with, kind of review what you do today and how you consider and what you're talking about with engagement. And is it really engagement, which to me, again, is how people feel, or is it connection, what people do? There's some relationship there, but they're different, right? Going back to the irrational and emotional self, the elephant and the rider. So review kind of what you're currently doing and say, hey, does this kind of fit where we need to be right now? And will this fit and help us moving forward? Maybe the answer is yes, but maybe it's not. So review kind of what you're currently doing. My guess is that you're currently doing a lot of probably pretty good things, but there's always some area of opportunity to kind of add some additional or revise and improve. But one thing I would definitely do is I would plan for the next phase today. And so understanding how your constituents feel, we're not asking them for money. We're not asking them, campaign perspectives or do you like the dean or how was the performance? Just asking people how they feel. The sooner we can move on that, the more agility we will have, because at some point, this current environment is going to shift back to a normal or a new normal. And if organizations are waiting around till then to try to figure out, okay, well, the dust is settled, let's figure out where to go, that's going to be a longer time to recovery if that's needed. So start planning today to give yourself maximum agility, and that way you can execute and move forward with the plan around engagement at a moment's notice. When you're thinking about engagement, no matter what you're doing, always plan for long-term effectiveness. So again, that's the difference between a satisfaction survey and an engagement survey. So, and it's the difference between, hey, do you love barbette or how was your steak? What if I don't order a steak again? I don't know if that question's relevant at a future visit. But how I feel about barbette, which is a great French restaurant here in Minneapolis, a couple blocks from me, that's a different question. So prepare to answer or prepare to think about questions and items that we can measure repeatedly over time and that are not subject to external factors in terms of that's not relevant question or we don't have any information around that. Remember, if we're actually having conversations with our constituents, which I hope we all are, and we're learning and they're sharing with us how they feel, let's make sure we're aligning that with what they're doing. So connection isn't bad. I wasn't ragging on that idea of connection and measurement of activity, but that's only half of who we are. We think and we do, and those things are often not always the same thing. Once again, I'll bring up my mega stuffed Oreo example versus eating, carrot sticks. So make sure that we're aligning that information with what we're seeing in our database, and that really allows us to identify those engagement inefficiencies. And then once we are able to identify those, like that 20% of loyal donors who do not feel engaged, let's execute. Let's come up with a plan. Now I know who they are. Every organization, again, you don't need my help identifying those that love you and do lots of stuff. You know who they are. Every organization also has some amount of people in your database who don't do anything and don't really feel a lot of engagement and love for you, at least as of today. And that's just a reality. We all do. But there's some amount of group that love you and not doing anything and doing a lot, but are not necessarily feeling the same way about you that you feel about them. Once we identify those groups, let's figure out our treatment options to try to target those now that I know who they are, and see if we can move the needle on their overall engagement. So with that, I think I have about 5 minutes left. There is a Q&A box, I believe, probably at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to submit a question there. And I'm going to slowly vamp and get a sip of coffee here. There is some additional resources, like I talked about at the top, at bwf.com/current resources. So be sure to check those out. All right, so a couple different questions that I've gotten for folks. Data collection method, that's a great question. To be honest, the most probably practical data collection method that we're using. So this question specifically was talking about modality. So is this a phone survey? Is this online? Is this in person? Is it through the mail? I think online is our best option. It's the way that we can reach the largest amount of folks. There are some things to be aware of. With every modality, there's blind spots, right? So, young people don't open their mail that often. And my mom, who's 70-something years old, I won't admit her age, she checks email once a week. So there's always differences in our modalities. There's no specific one that covers everything that I would suggest, but email is definitely the most effective and efficient way to put out a survey. So that's a great question. It was a question around kind of measuring connection on this grid before when I was sharing this. This is that idea around connection for me is what people are doing. So there's organizations that I love, to be honest. I mean, there's lots of, I get exposure to so many of you guys. There's so many great clients, there's so many great missions. There's places I think about, I'm like, oh man, that's such great, oh, I love them. And I hear about what my clients are doing right now, but I'm not financially supporting you. I'm not giving you money. I'm not coming to events. I mean, we can only do so much. So connection for me is a measure of activity and who people are. So patient, are you a patient or an alum? Have you made a gift? Have you come to an event? Are you related to other people that we know? That's the measure of connectivity. That's the traditional database stuff that we track and all those various tables versus engagement, which is this idea around asking you how you feel, which is different from actually what you actually might be doing. I have time for two more. So one is, how have clients distributed the same survey over a regular interval? Great question. And I'm having a lot of conversation right now too about we had some clients that were ready to move forward, and now we're kind of saying, is this the right time? Certainly, if we're doing this, kind of like the idea around the blood pressure, pulse, and temperature, like we're getting those vitals of our constituency, you probably wouldn't want to do this any quicker than every 6 months, because, let's say we do a survey, we align it, do some analysis, that takes another month, and then we understand it and we say, okay, well, what should we do? And we start to apply a treatment to try to move the needle, to try to make these folks feel engaged because they're acting like it, or try to activate these folks in blue because they feel like it, but they're not doing it. That takes time. So no less than 6 months, but I think if we get farther window out than every 12 months for doing a survey like this, again, 10 to 12 items should take 2 minutes or less. If you get outside 12 months, we lose our ability to be responsive and maybe be agile. And maybe we're going with a marketing campaign, or what we think is an effective campaign to drive awareness of our impact, or an effective campaign to increase overall engagement. And if we wait 18 months, and we don't see the philanthropy coming in, then we say, well, what happened? And we ask people, and we say, oh, people still feel the same as they did before. That might be too long for us. So you got to find a window of time, but typically it's going to be between 6 to 12 months is usually the window between surveys. And you can schedule that out over, a couple years. Keep asking the same questions, and then start programming and executing different ideas, and see what moves the needle and see what doesn't. So I know I have some other questions I wasn't able to get to. Sorry, ran out of time. As a fast talker, I still tried my best, but I'll be sure to follow up to everyone that I can at least identify in the Q&A. If you did submit a question as anonymous in the Q&A and you want me to follow up with you, please resubmit the question using your name, and I can follow up with you directly. Otherwise, I won't be able to respond directly. So with that, appreciate the time today. Sending everyone energy and light and healthy vibes. And thank you for joining us, and look forward to our next conversation.